Hey, Melanie,
Derek.
what's going on?
Uh, Happy to be alive.
I'm really hoping someday you give me a lot more of an enthusiastic, positive. I mean, I get it, but it's never like I'm excited,
That is
I'm
really how I feel
joyous.
inside. I feel a sense and a depth of awe in being alive, in the sun coming in your voice, in your presence.
Generous. That's generous. Okay. I'll take more of that. If you got more, I'll take more of that.
I don't know that there's anything more to that. That's the thing. I'm
Okay.
content. I'm in bliss. I'm in joy.
Okay. And of course, it's always good to be here with you in conversation and community. Always ready to have another great conversation with you and with our guests.
Yes.
But what's on your mind these days?
Mm, Wealth. Yeah, I mean, we are always talking about generational wealth, and we've had the benefit of realizing that we need to define what that is and what it is not. I think we, on our conversation so far this season, we've talked a lot about aspiration, ambition. Um, we've even talked about the importance of, as you steward your resources, thinking about where they will end up, how they'll be handled, who's going to handle them, and how do you want that to benefit who gets to handle them. So talk to in different ways about estate planning. And I know that in my work, I am routinely having conversations with people. And to be frank, they're often people whose families have resources to talk about. Okay. Where they're trying to think about how to leverage the money that the client has and leverage money that the family could contribute to make something happen, whether it's to buy the first home or to buy the next home where the children or grandchildren will live, and so on. But there are all these other frames around that need to be factored in. Like, where's the wealth coming from? When is it going to be available? Does that hinge on someone's death, to be honest? Um, and if so, does the client really know much about that money? Do they know how much it is, how much there is? Is the money in a trust? Do they have control over it? Do they have control over what happens with that money in 10 years such that they can make certain decisions now and not just depend on, a parent telling them what they can do with that money? So all of these things are important questions that, if you're not used to thinking about stewarding resources, you're not contemplating. I'm helping people navigate these all the time. But we're learning from, and we will learn a lot from today's guest about the fact that actually, even if you don't have a ton of money, there's a mindset that comes to being able even to build that kind of money, right? So the concept is beyond generational resources. It's beyond like, can I get money from my parents or grandparents? It's like, what is the dynasty? What are the 7 generations? What are the generations that come after you and come after them? Can you make decisions now that create a path so that 3 generations from now, people are not having to start all over again and have these same kind of conversations of, but how, but when, but if. So that's what's on my mind.
You've got a lot on your mind. But
Oh,
what I'll also add into the mix
yeah.
is the conversations that we had back during the reparations conversation, a couple of,
Yeah.
during that conversation where wealth wasn't just about
Yeah.
dollars and cents, wasn't just about finances, it was also about health, education, cultural autonomy. It was some of these intangibles that also contribute to the wealth of the individual, the wealth of the family, and the wealth of the community.
Yes.
And I I am an avid Instagram user, and I remember every so often I'll see this meme that says our ancestors something. I don't remember the full thing, but something about our ancestors' wildest dreams wasn't capitalism;
Oh,
it was freedom. And I'm paraphrasing greatly with what I'm saying with that because there's a little bit more just before and a little bit more just after. But that's sort of like the middle piece of that text. And then every so often it pops up in my feed, and I'm like, that's a good reminder because it does have to include when we talk about wealth and the health and wealth of a person and the family, it does have to include education, cultural autonomy, all these other intangibles, as I was saying
yeah.
before, that are beyond the dollars, because the dollars can come and go, but or you may not even have a lot of dollars, but you can still be wealthy in other ways.
And you transfer that. You transfer that down
Hmm.
psychologically, psychosocially, you transfer it down, frankly, even in DNA, right? And what that means, Derek Lumpkins, is that we are ancestors. So to understand ourselves as ancestors to coming descendants and what is it that we want to transfer, we get to be conscious of that right now. To me, that is part of reparations, is to be
Hmm.
conscious of what we're passing down and to do it as thoughtfully as we can. I think today's guest is going to help honestly reframe some of how we even understand the possibilities of that.
Right.
Um,
And before we bring her on, one of the things you say often, you have said often in this podcast, is that this is a podcast that's about Black freedom.
yeah,
And so that also has to be
yeah.
something that we think about when we think of wealth, and that we think about in terms of how do we pass that on and what shape does that take.
Yes. Freedom slash joy. Because, I don't like to use tropes. So I'm not somebody who's deeply invested in the concept or the language of black joy, black joy. Because it's like, what is that? Joy doesn't mean you're always giddy, right? But to have that kind of contentment, like when I got on this call and I'm like, I actually am just happy. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be alive. Can what we do help convey the kind of conditions for generations after us that they can feel a sense of contentment, that kind of joy, that quality of joy, and not just honestly fear, terror, confusion, doubt, but which frankly has been handed down in many ways from the conditions of slavery. We've inherited survival. Inherited a lot of survival capabilities from our ancestors, and there's so much to learn from that. And what can we add to that that the people who come after us can get? Some of that is going to be around, I think, tactics about understanding how to steward the wealth that you have, not just survive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
I'm ready for the guest. Let's bring her on.
Let's do it. All right. So today we're going to get to hear from and learn from Dr. LaTanya White. She is a trailblazing scholar practitioner operating at the nexus of global competitiveness, equity, entrepreneurship, and the racial wealth gap. Dr. White is a two-time author, TEDx speaker, and the founder of Concept Creative Group, a firm dedicated to business development, capacity building, and the pioneering framework for dynastic wealth. Driven by doctoral work at Antioch University's Graduate School of Leadership and Change, Dr. White's approach to intergenerational wealth transfer and Black business families nurtures both quantitative and qualitative forms of wealth, all through the lens of racial equity.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank
Welcome.
you. Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed the banter.
Oh,
We try. We try. It's a hard thing to banter about. Some of our other conversations, it's very clear like where we have starting points. But with this concept of dynastic Black wealth, which is something I think you have trademarked, or something that you have sort of coined that phrase, and that's what we're calling this episode is dynastic Black wealth. It's not something that's easy to explain succinctly. And of course, people also want to compare it to intergenerational wealth or generational wealth. So can you start us off with a very basic definition of the differences between the two?
Sure. And I think maybe for context, it will help if we really are taking some time to think about how we got to this place and, why this conversation is important. So I remember in 2016, American Express had just released this report. African American women are the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs. And it was exciting for me. I was teaching entrepreneurship at a historically Black college. I am an African American female entrepreneur. And I was like, okay, this means that things are going to be different, like from this day forward. So that was at the beginning of my doctoral journey. I remember citing that report in my personal statement. When I get to getting ready to defend my dissertation and wrapping up the literature review, I came across someone's dissertation that was published in the 1990s that referred to an article from the late 80s.
come on.
Same thing, that Black women business owners were the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs in the 80s. So if the same data is being lauded and applauded for 30 years, how is it that we're still having the same conversations about Black wealth, Black economic mobility, or the lack thereof? And so if generational wealth is the answer, why hadn't things changed for us from an economic position? And so that became kind of the basis of the research question that I unpacked in my dissertation. And what I learned was that our high net worth and ultra high net worth counterparts are transferring down more than just money.
Yeah.
Like, there's no way that the Rockefeller family, after 7 generations, have remained among America's 25 wealthiest families by just passing down money. Like, I bet my last dollar that they're
Mhm.
passing more than that. And so what my research found was that there are actually 5 forms of wealth that these families are cultivating, that they're intentionally packaging, protecting, and passing down. And that is how they reach what is referred to as dynastic status, where they've controlled their assets and their wealth, not just financial assets, but money. I'm sorry, but knowledge, relationships, social capital, identity. They pass those things down for 3 consecutive generations at least, in 4 different directions in those 5 forms of wealth. So those are the major points of distinction between what we understand generational wealth to be and what research and evidence has proven dynastic wealth is.
Mhm.
So you, in a very succinct way, presented a lot of information. So let's break it down just a little bit more, because you said there's the 5 forms of wealth, and we have this chart which we can show as well. And then you said there were 4 directions, and so that creates a lot of different permutations. So I'll put up the chart. That's a good place to start, and then I don't know if the directions will come in as part of that conversation.
Mhm, mhm. For sure. So yeah, we can get into it. So what I'll say for context, I study the relationship between entrepreneurial wealth and the racial wealth gap. I had found myself advocating for access to entrepreneurship education while I was still teaching on campus from a very heart-centered place. I didn't have the evidence or the logic or the reasoning to say it needs to be easier for students, especially students at historically Black colleges, to learn how to become entrepreneurs, to develop the entrepreneurial mindset. But what I found is that I came across some research that showed when you control for race, when you give an employed household and an entrepreneurial household the same amount of money to begin with, the entrepreneurial household experiences economic mobility faster. So my research is kind of grounded in what happens in entrepreneurial households. But one of the things that I found in working with Black families across the country is that it takes an entrepreneurial mindset,
Yes.
because there's something about talking to Black people about money and death, because these 2 things are inherent to the wealth transfer process. I have to own my mortality, right? I have to make sure that I'm okay knowing that I won't be here forever, and I need to create pathways and opportunities for other people to get access to these forms of wealth that I'm building in relationship and in community with my family. So the financial wealth is what we're seeing here is essentially the makings of any technical assistance program. If you are starting a business or growing a business or ready to acquire a business, so entrepreneurship through acquisition, you're going to make sure that you have these things in place to generate financial wealth, to have something that is your bottom line that is profitable. I think when we're, and that's the basis of the generational wealth, is financial assets. Is it stock? Is it real estate? Is it, the value of your business? So how do I transfer that to the next generation? That's typically what we understand generational wealth to be. When we look at these other 4 forms of wealth, which we can't put a number on, these are these qualitative forms of wealth. This is where our dynastic counterparts are coming into play.
Mhm.
Spiritual wealth is probably the they're not listed in order of importance by research, but through my own experience working with Black families, is if we don't have spiritual wealth, which is not couched in religion, right? It's really this idea that we're working towards something greater than ourselves. And if we aren't able to kind of funnel that through who are we as a family, what's important to us as a family, how do we document that so that my 9-year-old daughter, as she approaches her pre-tween and teenage years, she knows who she is. She's not seeking to learn who she is from social media or from culture, because it's literally like ingrained in her through what we have in our family constitution and how this is communicated through the family trust. And one of the things that's missing here is how that's communicated. And while in my family, we have a family reunion every other year, somebody is hunting me down about buying a t-shirt and am I coming to the scholarship banquet? Our counterparts are having family retreats. They are ensuring that the family constitution is being read, that the family investment portfolio is being analyzed, that people making distributions from the family trust have presented the return on investment.
Yeah.
And so the entire family is involved in how we got here, how we're going to stay here, and how we're going to elevate in future generations through this spiritual wealth. So I think that's probably one of the most important distinctions. I'll definitely pause there to open up for some dialogue, though.
I don't even know where to begin, because as you're describing this, what's that TV show that just recently ended? One on HBO about the wealthy family, the Roy family that owned the media empire.
Succession.
Succession, yes. So as you're describing this, you're reminding me of at least this part about the family constitution, which I never even heard of before, that concept of having that, but also looking at the family trust and having the family review the returns on the trust. It's reminding me of that show and how, I mean, this is like a whole nother direction, but, and how the siblings were fighting with each other to gain control of the trust. And so, my mind is going there in terms of like, well, how do you prevent that? Like, when the line item is the spiritual values, but then and it's not religion, it's not morality, it's not our values in terms of what we believe, it's more about the money. It almost feels like it's a little bit at odds. That vertical feels like it's at odds with itself.
I don't know. I want to argue a tiny bit, and I have to admit, I wanted to watch Succession. I really tried. It just was so monochromatic, and it just didn't have enough, frankly, heart for me. But yeah, so which was part of, I think, the whole thing about someone can come with the culture where that is identity. But I do think what you're saying, Derek, that stack is not necessarily in conflict with itself if you are invested not just in the transfer of money, but a transfer of identity. It really is about embodying something together and moving together, almost like a school of fish, like moving together. I think that's the thing that is the spiritual aspect of it. And what they're stewarding could, very much be about assets, but it could be about a business that has a social impact, that they want to know that they're always going to give to this thing. They're always going to make an impact in this way on the earth. And so I actually see a lot of potential there. I just want to interject, though, that it sounds like we're daring to say that, frankly, families that have been systematically and historically disenfranchised from being able to amass the kind of wealth that you're trying to figure out how to steward still have a reason and a purpose to think this way. We actually do need to be thinking this way about what we have, about who we are, and how we want to have that transferred. So just to make it very clear that we're not like, hey, this is like how white, very, very, very ultra white folks do this thing on TV and let's watch that. It's like, what actually can we actualize for ourselves in our own cultural and familial and economic context? Because we kind of need to do that for long-term sustainability, frankly, so that we're not, again, starting all over starting over and over 2 generations from now, where it's like, okay, well, so-and-so, I'll say this. I know in our initial conversation with LaTanya, and we're so delighted, LaTanya, that you sought us out from tracking our podcast, and you reached out to us and pitched a conversation. And we're so humbled by that and excited and eager to learn from you. In our initial conversation, Derek always with the great questions, was like, well, okay, so what are some families, Black families, that we can think of that are in this space? And are they doing that thing? Like, okay, you assume Oprah is probably doing that thing, but like, what about athletes who make money that their family has never even contemplated?
Right.
Are they going to run into a problem, or are they going to have a situation where they're handing down dynastic wealth? So you actually deconstructed that for us, and you're like, we don't yet know if they're on a path of dynastic wealth. But what we do know from some earlier conversations on this podcast this season is, oh, well, Aretha Franklin died with, it was confusing what she was actually, right? What was she actually leaving, and was she leaving it to whom? And her estate ended up having to go through probate, which is bananas. You think about our friend, the Black Panther, I've just forgotten his name.
Chadwick Boseman.
Died without a will. So, and they had a scholarship fund, right? They were making impact. He was leaving behind impact, but there wasn't a plan. There wasn't an intergenerational holding of a plan. So we don't yet know who's actually pulling off this thing, but we're learning about how this is relevant to us, even if we don't have even that kind of wealth.
And that was one of our earlier questions from the intro conversation too. Is this for the Oprahs of the world, or is this for the Dereks and Melanies of the world?
Yeah.
And what I love, so many things are coming up. I will first like to kind of drop this anecdote here. Melanie, you may be familiar with this, shared a lot in private wealth communities, the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. And so,
but I don't know what it refers to actually.
Yeah, so it refers to when we're talking about that first generation wealth creator, right? Whether it be through entrepreneurship or through capitalism, however the wealth has been first generated. Literally what the anecdote is you're looking at someone who's rolling up their shirt sleeves to like get the work done, to build the business, to create the wealth. And that second generation becomes the beneficiary of that. They're the beneficiary of just the wealth. The knowledge had not been transferred. The identity had not been transferred, so that then by the third generation, that money's lost. And the third generation is back rolling up their shirt sleeves to start from scratch. And I think if we, like you said, we dare to have conversations like this, especially in communities and industries and verticals where wealth is being created at a rapid clip, without really knowing how you did it, without really knowing who you are, and without really knowing what you want to create. So a part of dynastic wealth and the identity around your intent to create something that is going to better someone's economic opportunities 2 or 3 generations from now is different from, I just need to make sure that my grandchildren don't have to take out student loans. That's a completely different conversation, right?
That's a worthy aim, period.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And when we're talking about the racial wealth gap, that's typically household data, is looking at what's happening in the house and zip code 32305, right? But entrepreneurial wealth and personal wealth is really looking at the person. So how do we translate what's happening in that person's mind to how it impacts who lives in the home and the spheres of influence of those people in the community? Now we're talking about these waves of impact that can be created simply from how we shift our identity and our relationship around money and wealth transfer.
Is dynastic wealth, you mentioned community a couple of times. Is dynastic wealth as we're talking about, it's siloed. So is it just a family, or does it have a relationship with a community as well?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I think so what we can get into are the other pillars. So we talked a little bit about financial wealth, we touched on spiritual wealth. Let's if we look at the wealth of knowledge and intellectual wealth, the answer to
Mhm.
your question is actually in relational wealth, Derek, though. But it's important that we really kind of unpack the wealth of knowledge. And this is where we're talking about, family recipes. When my great grandmother passed away, no one knew the recipe to like these biscuits that she made, right? So we're all scrambling because it didn't even feel like a family gathering, first of all, without our matriarch. And second of all, without something that was core to our identity as a family. And so the family history, those family recipes, even, if we're talking about financial assets, whose name is on the deed to the family home. Like those kinds of things really come into this wealth of knowledge. And then you can see how those things impact beyond just the family and into the community. Because maybe your family, your grandmother's home was the place where everyone in the neighborhood gathered, right? This was where the block parties were in the summer. There's community history built into the wealth of knowledge in your family. But if we don't take ownership of that, then my daughter and her children will have no connection to those things, and they won't feel any responsibility or really any ownership to maintain those things. Because how many times have there been conversations about, I don't want to pay the taxes on grandma's house, like let's just fix it up and sell it. What about the history that's in grandma's house, right? That has so much to do with who we are and how we have created wealth intellectually through our own lived experiences that produce these passions, skills, and abilities that
Mhm.
can then turn into ways that can be monetized when we self actualize. And so, Melanie, I know you mentioned that term earlier, actualizing. There's an opportunity for us to self actualize when we are intentional about re, re like reintroducing ourselves to who we are, and making sure that the members of our family know that and can help us to master those skills. And then we get into relational wealth. And this is where leadership, philanthropy,
Mhm.
service, and where we're really seeing that kind of benefit the community, but it's because we've done this internal work first before going out to the community, and sharing those things.
Oh, you're saying so much. Can you give us a couple of examples about how family can, well, an individual,
Yeah,
and then in relation to their own relatives,
yeah.
can do that actualizing, can understand their identity, understand their value set, articulate it to each other so that they can reflect it between each other?
Yeah, I think so. My family, I share there are four generations of us, and there are 16 tax paying adults, and that's how we had to like
I appreciate that.
right? Because we don't have a trust, we don't have family wealth. So there are 16 of us, tax-paying adults, that committed to putting money into this vehicle so that we can then make a bulk purchase of real estate or real estate investment or whatever it's going to be. Maybe we acquire a business. But what we found was that we all had these different skill sets, right? We're all passionate. We're all excited about different things. But how are we using that in relation to the family?
Yeah.
Most of us are just out here doing our own things, right?
Mhm.
So that was how we, in our discussions, in our talks about 2.5 years of work, right? Really having conversations with each other about money. And then we get to learn about, I have this one cousin who, my older cousin, I know what corner I can find him on any given day in the city that we grew up in. But that's not to say that his lived experience is any less valuable than my cousin who's an accountant, right? So in learning about what he loves, I learned that he's great with his hands. He can paint, fix anything. So our responsibility as a family, if he is willing to accept it, accept the investment in him, is to maybe help him get his general contractor's license, help him self-actualize in something that he loves to do already, because that provides an investment, a qualitative investment in his identity, which can also be turned into a quantitative investment into the family's fund.
Yep.
And that's one of the ways, but you have to know who people are. You have to, we
Yes.
talk about equity. You have to also help people know they belong in this
Yes.
conversation about money.
Woo, that's so plenty. That's plenty. I'm gonna let that digest. Thank you. That's a really, really helpful example.
Yeah, I'm also just trying to think about in a multi-generational family. So whether it's 3 generations or 4 generations, how that conversation even begins. Like how it begins, one,
Yeah.
like who initiates that? Because you would kind of expect to be the matriarch or the patriarch saying, I'm this many number of years, and so I want to pass this down. But maybe it's a second generation or third generation, who knows? And I don't know if you have done this with your family, but how do the children get involved? How do they respond? Because I'm sure, if they're young, they may just be learning numbers or learning, the value of $1 or $10. So how do you get them to think in a much more abstract way?
hmm So the earlier part of this thread, Derek, though, it goes back to belonging. So I have been advocating and talking about wealth building through entrepreneurship because that's my lived experience. And what I recognized was that I was the only entrepreneur in the family. So nobody felt like they belonged in that conversation. It wasn't until I was introduced to Dorothy A. Brown's The Whiteness of Wealth,
Mm.
and her book on racism built into America's tax structure, that everyone else began to see themselves as a player in
Yes.
this part of this story about building wealth. I had an uncle who were sending their daughter off to college for the first time. I had a cousin and his wife who were buying a home. There was another set of cousins that had, a child entering the public school system. And so now everybody could see how their life paths would play a role in getting back to, well, what do we do now? Now that we know this, it was that book that brought us together, where everybody felt like, okay, I can talk to Tanya about this wealth thing now, because before she was just talking about entrepreneurship and that had nothing to do with me. And so now we have everyone that sees themselves, and they're taking ownership of their identity as it relates to building wealth, and what that has meant for my daughter. So she's in the meetings, right? She may
Mm.
not understand everything, but now when she hears dynastic, well, she's like, "Oh, mommy, that's what you talk about." Or
Mhm.
when she hears the word dissertation, she's like, "Mommy, you did one of those," right? So it's really about the exposure. And so in that last pillar on relational wealth, there is this idea of entrepreneurial pre-exposure.
I
And
love
so while we're talking about, you don't have to be an entrepreneur. You do need an entrepreneurial mindset. You need the grit, the resilience, the thick skin, the familiarity with rejection to lead a Black family, in discussions about money and death if you're going to create a dynasty.
Melanie, you seem very amused. Or are you pleased?
all of it. All of it. All of it. Money and death. Money and death. Money and death. Um, I also appreciate understanding what stimulated this. What got your family aligned was this book by Dorothy A. Brown. I had just mentioned her to you, Derek, like a month ago, because I heard her interviewed on public radio, and the episode was actually WTF. What the fuck does race have to do with taxes on Code Switch? It was a really good episode. There was a lot that I agreed with, and then some things I could argue with about her perspectives about what this means for Black people's potential in generating wealth. But it was basically like, we're losing all the time by the fact that the way that the tax code works. I mean, it's stunning. So I think, and there's some certain assumptions she made about real estate that I don't exactly agree with, given the kind of metropolitan market I work in. But, I think there's so much for us to empower ourselves on. So I'm laughing at how it all lines up and how all these points of references are coming before us to be recognized. I'm like, all about like, we need to learn about what this woman does. And then you write us. And it turns out your whole family was stimulated by her work. Death and money.
Yes.
And how it can lead to enjoyment over time.
Yes. Yeah, totally. So Derek, death doesn't mean, gloom. It just means it actually recognize what you have right now. It's like, oh, this moment counts. This time counts. This lifetime counts. These relationships matter. I need to make this happen. I need to leverage this connection, this opportunity, these relationships, leverage my connection to these elders before they're not here anymore. Can't take stuff for granted, whether it's family recipe or even understanding some key decisions that they made that allowed them to acquire the property they have or hold on to the property they have or establish the business they have. No, it's like actually getting excited about the right now.
Oh yeah.
Death is coming.
I'm not saying that death necessarily means gloom, or that we're necessarily talking about gloom.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to our conversation with MJ, Melinda, around ambition, that episode, where she's describing the need to celebrate and how a lot of people who are doing some first generational things, them to be first generation immigrants, but first generational actions, spend so much time saying, okay, I've done this, on to the next. I've done this, on to the next. They don't take time to celebrate. And so that's where I'm like, okay, sure, money and death, they are certainties.
You're right.
Well, at least you hope the money part is a certainty, but the death part is definitely a certainty. And so it's like, but you still have to leave time for the enjoyment as well.
You. Right. And you are so good. You are honestly such an inspiration for me in that, because I
celebrate too much.
You live and love the F out of life. I love it. Thank you.
Sure. LaTanya, before we let you go, are there any things that you can suggest to the viewers as in terms of ways in which to start? Like you say, there's a mindset, there's conversations, there's certain entrepreneurial actions. So like, where can people see themselves as a starting point?
Yeah. So actually, one of the things that I forgot to share was, as I was kind of reading through, all of this information, the whiteness of wealth and trust, all the things, right? One of the things that I needed to do was actually develop my data collection skills and data analysis skills. So I built out this quiz that I shared with my family, because I wanted to figure out, well, how do people see themselves in the conversation around wealth? And so I called it a wealth personality quiz. And I have a kind of sarcastic slant. So in some of the options, one of the questions was, what's your vision for wealth? And if you recall, there is that vision for wealth that shows up on like 2 or 3 of the pillars, right? What's your vision for wealth? And one of the options was, what vision? And, my family members, I'm highly educated, right? We're degreed out the yin yang in higher education, in real estate, in healthcare. And about 40 to 50% of the respondents said, what vision? And it was like this really disorienting moment, because my thought was, well, why are we working so hard if we have no vision?
Yes.
And so that quiz I actually have created. It's like open source. I keep it on my website. People can use it to begin these conversations with their family members, because what it does, it provides just like some resources, like it links to the whiteness of wealth. It links to some other resources to really get people situated in understanding like who they are on this journey to wealth in the context of their family. And so that's the Dynastic Wealth Personality Quiz. It's somewhere on my website. I can give you the link if you want to share it with the audience.
Sure, please tell us your website.
Yes. So it's meetdrwhite.com, MEETDR white.com.
Even though, it's a short conversation, you pack so much information. And, as I was saying before, it's great to have the chart because I'm definitely a visual learner. I learn best through like seeing something and being able to digest it through sight and through reading it. And seeing the relationship between all of the different pieces. So that's incredibly helpful. And I'm sure anybody who's watching, because people are watching, some people are listening, but for those people who are watching, I'm sure they'll be able to like pause it, really, look at it, maybe do a screenshot, and then they can go to your website and, maybe reach out to you. I don't know. Do you respond to people who reach out to you? Like, what's your relationship to audiences who might say, hey, I saw you here, or I heard you speak. Can I talk to you about X?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of ways to engage. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. I keep a calendar open for folks who just want to learn a little bit more, like do a discovery call about dynastic wealth.
I'm
There
gonna do
is Okay. There is the Dynastic Wealth Training Academy that's coming online. So when I left the university, I've been teaching for 11 years. When I left the university after defending my dissertation, I shared with my dean, who I'd known since I was 19 years old. I said, I need to be in a space that centers and elevates Black entrepreneurship. And so opportunities like this are essentially the manifestation of that promise that I was making to myself. And so I thank you for the opportunity to elevate this discussion around dynastic wealth.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you again for reaching out to us. I don't think we would have ever thought to have a conversation on this topic if you or someone like you hadn't approached us and said, hey, have you thought about this? I'd love to talk to you about it. And, so we really appreciate this. We are learning a lot. We continue to learn a lot from you and from this concept. And, Melanie will do the call. I'm going to look back at the chart again, and, maybe Melanie and I will compare notes, and then I may do a call as well. But I'm sure we'll see you and talk to you again in the near future.
Thank you. I look forward to that.
Same here. And for those of you who are watching, if you have questions, again, feel free to leave us questions in the question field on whatever platform you're watching, or send your questions apparently directly to Dr. White. And please remember to like, subscribe, and share. We would appreciate that. And we will see you the next time on the Black Landing Forum. Take care.